Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
With all the excitement surrounding the 2019 edition of the Cleveland Browns, and understanding just how bad the Browns have been since their rebirth in 1999, it's hard to imagine that this team was once the cream of the crop in the NFL. Yes, the Browns were the NFL's best team, but it was so long ago that very few can remember the last coach to lead the Browns to a championship. And while he only won one title, he did play for more. Next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, the forgotten career of Blanton Collier.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad you can join us for a look back at a career so few know little about. The coaching career of Blanton Collier, the last man to lead the Cleveland Browns to an NFL championship. I say NFL because before the Super Bowl was played, the first occurring in 1967 between the Green Bay Packers and Kansas City Chiefs, the NFL staged its own championship, and in 1964, the Browns beat the Baltimore Colts 27-0. That, folks, is the last time the Browns won a championship title. In fact, here's a little rundown. The Browns came into existence in 1946 as a member of the newly formed AAFC, the All-America Football Conference. Cleveland went on to win the AAFC championship in 1946, 47, 48, and 1949. Cleveland's first year as a member of the NFL was 1950, and they beat the Los Angeles Rams to capture the NFL crown 30-28. In 1951, the Rams returned the favor, beating the Browns 24-17. Cleveland proceeded to lose the next two championships, 17-7 and 17-16, to the Detroit Lions. Yeah, once upon a time, the Lions were pretty good too. In 1953, Cleveland downed the Lions 56-10, and in 1955, Cleveland beat the Rams again 38-14. Cleveland missed the 56 championship game, but came back strong in 1957, only to lose to the Lions again 59-14. The Browns slid a little after that game, but with Jim Brown in the lineup, started climbing to the top. And in 1964, with Blanton Collier at the helm, reached the pinnacle, downing the Baltimore Colts 27-0. They lost to the Packers in 1965, 23-12, the Colts in 1968, 34-0, and made their final NFL championship appearance in 1969, losing to the Minnesota Vikings 27-7. In all, including the AAFC, that's an incredible 15 championship appearances in 24 years, and on 8 occasions, they walked off the field as champions. Of course, most of those championships came with the legendary Paul Brown leading the way, but Blanton Collier didn't disappoint. In fact, in his 8 years as coach of the Browns, Collier went 76, 34, and 2, and his worst year was his last year, 1970, when Cleveland went 7-7. Joining us in just a moment will be Roger Gordon. Some of you might remember Roger from episode 21 when we spoke to him about the career of the quarterback who led the Browns to the 1964 championship, Frank Ryan. Roger is back with us for this episode about Collier, someone he speaks a great deal about in his new book, Blanton's Browns, a terrific recap of Cleveland's superior years of 1964 through 1969. Before we get there, though, remember, there are several ways you can follow Sports Forgotten Heroes. Follow us on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. Check out Sports Forgotten Heroes on Instagram. Look for our page on Facebook, or follow us on the web at sportsfh.com. In fact, on sportsfh.com, I have links to a lot more about Blanton Collier, and you can learn more about today's guest, Roger Gordon. Also, please send us your comments about today's show, and on sportsfh.com, you can suggest topics for upcoming episodes, or check out more information on any of our past episodes and our past guests. As always, please, wherever you can, leave us a rating. Leave it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. Hey, as I've mentioned previously, we are relaunching our Patreon page, and I need a favor from all of you. Please, let us know what type of extra content you might want to hear. If you'd like to submit direct questions to our guests, what kind of contests would interest you, and how we can make our Patreon page even better. Please let us know by sending an email to Warren at sportsfh.com. That's Warren at sportsfh.com. Also, later on, we'll reach into our mailbag and read some more of your comments. Back to Blanton. He was a career coach, getting his start at the age of 22 for Paris High School in Kentucky in 1928. He stayed through the 1943 season and then moved on to Navy, where he served as an assistant coach in 1944 and 1945. And then in 1946, he joined the staff of Paul Brown with the newly formed Cleveland Browns. He served as an assistant under Brown from 1946 through 1953 and then went back to the college ranks where he replaced Bear Bryant at Kentucky as the Wildcats head coach. Over the course of 8 years, Collier went 41, 36, and 3. In 1962, Collier rejoined Cleveland as an offensive assistant and then was elevated to head coach in 1963, where he remained through the 1970 season before calling it quits at the age of 64. Was he done? Well, Blanton rejoined the Browns in 1975 for a 2-year stint as the team's quarterback coach before finally retiring for good. All right, let's get to more about Blanton with Roger Gordon, the author of the new book, Blanton's Browns. Roger, welcome back to Sports Forgotten Heroes. Last time we spoke, we talked about Frank Ryan. What have you been up to since then?
Since then, I think that was probably about 2 years ago or something, I think. Since then, I put the finishing touches on my new book that just came out about a month ago about the late 60s Browns. And I also had a book come out just a couple days ago, an NFL trivia book honoring the 100th season of the NFL. So since our last interview, I was busy putting those together.
Very cool. The book that you just came out with, Blanton's Browns, why call the book Blanton's Browns instead of something about, more Cleveland-esque?
Well, my publisher came up with that title, I got to admit. I think it's a good title. I think it kind of rolls off the tongue. Yeah, I don't know. I think think Blanton Collier. He wasn't a rah-rah coach like Vince Lombardi. He was a very scholarly, down-to-earth players coach. I think the players looked at him as a father figure or even a grandfather figure, and they respected him so much. I think they probably titled it that because, he was the head coach, and, I think even though he wasn't a rah-rah guy, he still commanded the respect of all his players. And that's, you'd have to ask my publisher beyond that.
Let me ask you this. Blanton Collier, what intrigues you so much about Blanton?
I think just what I said, that he was not a rah-rah guy, but he still he proved that you can command respect from your players without being a yelling, loud, obnoxious coach. And another thing that sort of fascinated me about him, which I only mentioned in the foreword by Gary Collins, was that he had a very hard time hearing.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And I'm pretty sure that's why he retired after the 1970 season, was because of his hearing problems. But even with his hearing problems, he was still able to, coach some great teams.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Roger, while we're going to spend some time talking about players and different aspects of the Brown teams that Collier coached, I think a fair way to start our conversation about Blanton is this. How or was it difficult for Blanton Collier to come in and replace a legend? I mean, even though Paul Brown did not have the best of seasons in 1962 with the Browns going 7-6-1, he was still a legend. And it's not always the wisest choice to be the guy who comes in immediately after a legend leaves. So was that difficult for Blanton?
I'm pretty sure that they were not on speaking terms. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that when Brown found out that Collier was going to replace him, I'm pretty sure that they did not speak to each other again until the Browns and Bengals met in an exhibition game in 1970. I'm not 100% sure about that, but Paul Brown was was not happy that his good friend Blanton Collier was going to replace him. Do I think it was hard for Blanton Collier? I mean, anytime you replace a good friend like that, I'm sure it probably was. I should have read that book that Blanton Collier's daughter wrote about him. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I should have probably read that book in preparation to write my book, but I didn't. But so, just naturally, it probably was a little bit hard, but, it sure didn't seem like it in the records. I mean, they went from 7-6-1 to 10-3, or I mean 7-6-1 to 10-4, and almost winning the Eastern Conference in Collier's first year. And I think it's unfair of people when they say, "Well, Blanton Collier won with Paul Brown's players." Well, he did win with Paul Brown's players, but Paul Brown wasn't winning with Paul Brown's players.
Exactly.
In like 62, 61, 60, 59, they were like 8-5, 7-6-1, decent records, but not up to what the Browns had used to do. So he Collier won with those players. He did a lot better with those players than Paul Brown was able to the last 3 or 4 years.
Mm-hmm. And what about Brown? He had an incredible record with the Browns, a team that was named after him. In all, his record was 158 wins, 48 losses with 8 ties for the Browns, and he won 3 NFL championships to go along with 4 All-America Football Conference championships. There was little he had not accomplished. But if I follow correctly, he and the team's new owner at that time, Art Modell, they didn't really see eye to eye. So what was it that Brown and Modell didn't see eye to eye on, and why was Brown unable to stop the team from from sliding further down the standings.
I mean, I think between the two of them, that it was a power struggle. Modell came in, this hotshot, that TV executive coming in from New York who doesn't have a career in football, and he starts making these trades, I think, without informing Paul Brown. And Paul Brown was very upset when he found out that they were making, I don't know how many trades it was, but there were football decisions that Art Modell was making without even notifying Paul Brown. And I think Paul Brown was not only the head coach, but I think he was also the general manager. Mm-hmm. So, when Modell started doing that, Paul Brown didn't like that. And I think Modell was hanging around practices a lot, and I don't think Paul Brown liked that either. I think the owner before Modell, since the Browns started in 46, I don't think Paul Brown was used to the owners of the team hanging around practice all the time. And Modell apparently did do that and making moves without notifying him. And I think that just got them off to a bad start. And I think Brown disliked Modell more than Modell disliked Brown. But by the end, I think they both disliked each other.
So out goes Paul Brown and in comes Blanton Collier. How did his style differ from Brown's? I mean, I read in your book where Paul Brown believed more in a one-on-one attack, that you block someone and you stay on him, you drive him into the ground, whereas Collier believed more in an attack where you would block someone and then move on to the next guy. That's just one subtle difference in their philosophies. In what other ways did they differ?
Well, I mean, as far as I know, the difference between the 1962 offense and the 1963 offense, Paul Brown, Jim Brown, I think, almost doubled his yardage total rushing. Now, that may not sound like opening up the offense, and I'm not a football tactician, but and I'm not sure about the quarterback's statistics from 62 to 63, but I do know in one way or another, the players were very happy because Blanton Collier did open up the offense much more. Paul Brown was playing very close to the vest, and some players were thinking that the time was passing him by, or that the NFL was passing him by. I mean, he did the innovations like the face mask and the messenger guard system, but the players felt that he was stuck in 1955, I guess, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so Blanton Collier immediately opened up the offense. And I think Collier in 62, I think he was
an offensive. Yeah, he was an offensive
coordinator. Yeah, so I think he was the offensive coordinator. So that made a difference right off the bat. How they opened up the offense, I'm not 100% sure, because Jim Brown doubling his running total, you would think, okay, they're running the ball more. How can that be opening up the offense? And don't have an answer to that, but they did open up the offense a lot more. Somehow, some way, it was a lot more opened up than it was in 62, and the players loved that.
Sure. In 62, their starting quarterback was Frank Ryan,
Ryan? Okay.
Yeah, and he threw for 1,541 yards. In 63, he upped that to 2,025, and then in 64, he increased that to 2,404, and a couple years later, 1966, he had his biggest year where he threw for almost 3,000 yards, and that was in 14 games. It's not like it is today with the offenses today. I mean, 2,974 yards is a lot of yardage, and that went along with 29 touchdowns.
29 touchdowns. I think that 29 touchdowns was a record for the Browns until Brian Saint broke it in 1980. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sure.
But so, Brown's numbers went up, Ryan's numbers went up, the wins went up. So, however they opened up the offense, he opened up the offense, he did. And I know the players were very happy about that.
Mm-hmm. You touched on this just a little while ago, that one of the biggest challenges that Blanton Collier faced was his hearing. He was almost deaf and he needed hearing aids. How did that affect his ability to coach?
I just know it was a problem. But look at the success they had with him, even with the problem. Can you imagine what they would have done if he could actually hear? If he could have actually heard?
Sure, yeah.
But I didn't really get into that other than with Gary Collins.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I'm not really sure about that. But I do know it was a problem. It was definitely a problem.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Collins told me that he retired because of that.
Okay, time for a little sidebar. Collier's daughter, Dr. Kay Collier McLaughlin, wrote a wonderful book about her father called Football's Gentle Giant, The Blanton Collier Story. And in it, she discussed Blanton's hearing loss. According to Kay, no one could determine whether or not Blanton was born with the disability. The only thing they knew for sure was the condition was inoperable. As his daughter wrote, he had an inoperable nerve deafness involving loss of discrimination more than the loss of volume. In other words, if folks shouted him, it still wouldn't help, and he struggled in a room with lots of background noise. Blanton became an expert at lip reading, which amusingly led to his dislike of beards. Blanton's wife would help him with phone calls because he could hear sounds, but he couldn't distinguish words. She would sit by the phone and write down what the speaker would say. Even Art Modell tried to find help for him, but that didn't work. Blanton did the best he could at reading lips in press conferences, and the media respected him so much that they worked with him, even restating questions without any fear. His biggest worry, though, was the sideline phone to the press box, which gave him great trouble, and that ultimately played a very pivotal role in his retiring from the game. Before Blanton became coach of the Browns, he was an assistant with the team, but was ultimately let go, and that's when he wound up with Kentucky as its head coach. What led to Blanton's dismissal from the Browns in his first go-round, if you know? And then, of course, after his days at Kentucky, he rejoined the Browns, like we said, as an offensive assistant. So what led to his dismissal his first go-round? Do you have any idea on that?
I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I think I don't think he'd been a head coach before anywhere at any level. I'm not sure.
No, he was in high school. In high school, he was a high school head coach for a number of years.
I think he looked at it as an opportunity to be a head coach at even though Kentucky has never really been a football school, it's still a big time school. And I think he looked at it as getting a chance to be a head coach, and probably because his ultimate goal, I would think, would be to be a head coach in the NFL, and I think he thought he would have a better shot of becoming an NFL head coach if he had some college head coaching experience.
Mm-hmm. And
that's what I'm thinking.
And of course, when he went to Kentucky, he had to follow a legend there as well. He had to replace Bear Bryant. I wonder how that helped him prepare, if it did at all, for replacing a guy like Paul Brown.
You mean replacing Bear Bryant?
Yeah, like first he replaced Bear Bryant. Yeah. So he had to replace a legend there, and then he had to replace a legend in Cleveland in Paul Brown. So I wonder,
was Bear Bryant a legend at that time?
All right, Roger brings up a great point. Was Bear Bryant a legend at that point in his career? That's why I love Sports Forgotten Heroes, because you never know where it will take you. In looking back, I guess Bryant was only in the beginning stages of establishing his legend. He started off at Maryland, where he went 6-2-1 in 1945. In 1946, he was named coach of Kentucky, where he remained through the 1953 season, compiling a record of 60 wins, 23 losses, and 6 ties. And that included a mark of 11-1 in 1950. A most interesting year. You see, Kentucky topped an undefeated Oklahoma team in the Sugar Bowl 13-7. Now, back in those days, the final rankings were announced prior to the bowl games, so Oklahoma was number 1 and was named the national champions. Kentucky finished the year ranked 7th, but several other polls were taken after the bowl games and declared Kentucky as the number 1 team in the country. Anyway, Bryant left the program after the 1953 season because he didn't want to take a back seat to Adolph Rupp and the basketball team. Bryant then moved on to Texas A&M, where he really made a name for himself with the Junction Boys, a Texas A&M team that he ultimately led to a 9-win and 1-tie record without any losses in 1956 to win the Southwest Conference. So, was Collier following a legend? Nah, I guess not at that point. But he was following a coach who lifted Kentucky to heights it had never experienced before. Collier, who had spent 7 years under Paul Brown with Cleveland, filled the opening at Kentucky. In his 8 years there, he went 41, 36, and 3 ties. Kentucky fired him after the 1961 season, sort of unfairly. Like Bryant before him, the football team played second fiddle to the basketball team, and the university placed recruiting restrictions on the football staff that were very difficult to overcome. So, like Bryant, Collier found recruiting hard. But he sure put together one heck of a staff that included Don Shula, Chuck Knox, Howard Schnellenberger, and Bill Arnsberger. One more note about Collier in Kentucky. His best season came in 1954, his first year with the team, when he went 7-3, 5-2 in the SEC, and was named the conference's Coach of the Year. So, Blanton's first year, getting back to Blanton Collier, Blanton's first year with the Browns as their head coach was 1963, and right. Cleveland went 10-4 to finish second in the Eastern Conference. Pretty good start to his career with Cleveland. Then in 64, the Browns went 10-3-1, and they won the NFL championship over the Baltimore Colts. What can you tell us about Blanton's first couple of years with the Browns and the kind of impact he had on the team?
I think he had a big impact. Even though, like I said, even though he wasn't a rah-rah coach, I think he treated the players. I think he treated them with respect. I mean, obviously, I never interviewed the guy, but from talking to some of the players that I interviewed for the book, I didn't talk to one player who didn't like him. Mm-hmm. I mean, he was a player's coach, and I think the players loved playing for him. Mm-hmm. I just think they loved, would have tried to run through a brick wall for him. Mm-hmm. And and I think, especially on the offensive side of the ball, like we talked about, he took the shackles off of the offense, and I think the players had been wanting that for the last 3 or 4 years of Paul Brown being the head coach. So I think he had a big impact. And then, he probably had an impact on the defense too, because when the defense saw how well the offense was playing, that probably made them play better too. And give them, or that probably made them play better too. I mean, I just think it, what's the word I'm thinking of? It was, the offense doing well, and then the defense sees how well they're doing and they do well. It rubbed off on them, I think. Mm-hmm. And one thing about that 64 Browns defense was a bend but don't break unit. But it bended a lot, but it didn't break a lot. and I'm not looking at the book right now, but one thing that a lot of Browns fans, old Browns fans, might not know is that it came pretty close to happening that one of the defensive backs would have had to start the Baltimore game in the '64 title game because Frank Ryan was either, I think he was injured a little bit, and then
he had a bum shoulder.
And then the backup was Jim Nanowski was in the hospital all week. He had some sort of flu. He lost like 20 pounds. And without looking at the book, I can't remember which two defensive backs who had quarterbacking experience in college. But there were two defensive backs that were having nightmares nights before the game thinking, am I going to have to start the championship game?
The two defensive backs Roger is referring to are Ross Fichtner, I hope I got that right, and Bobby Franklin. Fichtner, who played DB in the NFL, actually played quarterback at Purdue in 1957, 58, and 1959. Over the course of 3 seasons, he completed 60 passes on 155 attempts and threw for 9 touchdowns. Bobby Franklin, also a DB, who also played quarterback in college for Ole Miss, during the same years Fichtner was at Purdue, completed 85 passes on 194 attempts and threw for 12 touchdowns. His best season was 1958 when he led the Rebels to a 9-2 mark, a national ranking of 11th, and a Gator Bowl win over Florida. Fichtner, by the way, played 8 seasons for the Browns and 1 with the New Orleans Saints. For Cleveland, he intercepted 27 passes and scored 3 touchdowns. Franklin played all 7 of his seasons for Cleveland, intercepted 13 passes, and scored 2 touchdowns. Now, back to 1964, as we said. Ryan was nursing a sore shoulder, and Jim Nanowski had some sort of virus and lost 25 pounds. Had Ryan been unable to go, Blanton Collier would have looked towards Fichtner or Franklin. As it was, the Colts roughed up Ryan pretty good that day, but he was able to stay in the game and led the Browns to the 1964 championship win. Well, let's talk about that championship game. What can you tell us, from the standpoint of the Baltimore Colts, if I remember correctly, were pretty heavily favored in that game, and the Browns came in and they took it right to them.
Yeah, maybe not offensively, but defensively they did. And when the score was 0-0 at halftime, the players in the Browns locker room, from what I was told, they, even though it was 0-0 and they weren't winning, it was like a victory to be tied with Baltimore 0-0, and it just told them we're going to win this game. We held them to 0 points, I guess, especially the defense. They were just so confident coming out in the third quarter. And, even though Jim Brown didn't score any touchdowns and it was pretty much all Frank Ryan and Gary Collins, there was a very important run by Brown. I think it was like a 45 or 50 yarder that I think it helped set up. I think the first either the first field goal or the first touchdown. One of the first scores by the Browns was set up by a very long. It was either a Brown run of 45 or 50 yards, or it was a catch and run of 45 to 50 yards. Mm-hmm. So and Brown ended up. I think he ended up with over 100 yards rushing. So even though he didn't have any touchdowns, he was still a vital part of the game.
And of course, Frank Ryan had a heck of a game, and he and Gary Collins connected on 3 touchdown passes, and including one being a 51-yarder. So it was, you're right, it was a lot about Cleveland's defense as they beat the Colts 27-0. But then the following year, the Browns went 11-3. So they improved in the wins department, and they returned to the championship game. And what I find interesting is that in each of those 2 games, the 64 championship game and the 65 championship game, the defensive play calling was taken away from the defensive coaches. Do you know why that is?
From interviewing Bernie Parrish, when I interviewed him, he told me that he called the defensive plays in the 64 title game. The coaches didn't. He did. Then in the 65 title game at Green Bay, he said for some reason the coaches told him that the coaches are going to call the defensive plays. You're not going to call the defensive plays in the Green Bay game. And Parrish said that's why they lost the game. And Parrish also told me, it's been so long since I talked to him, but he told me that something to the effect that if the coaches told Bernie, if you go against our wishes and you do call the defensive plays on your own, Art Modell is going to have security escort you out of Lambeau Field.
Why is that, though? If the guy did so well in 64 calling defensive plays and shutting out an offense that had Johnny Unitas and John Mackey, why would they take the defensive calling away from him? What was the philosophy behind that?
Well, that's what I asked Bernie, and if he didn't know the answer, I certainly don't know the answer. 50 years later, he's still trying to figure out why they did that. So he didn't have an answer for me. But one thing Gary Collins told me was, even though the playing surface was terrible with the mud and all that stuff, he said that he was upset with the offensive play calling because I think the Browns' only touchdown was on a pass from Ryan to Collins. And he said they were actually throwing it pretty well. And then all of a sudden in the second half, the coaches decided to stop throwing it and start running it. And he said he never got an answer. And he said if we would have continued throwing it, he said that we would have won the game. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would you want to throw the ball on a terrible field? But that's what he told me. That's what he told me.
Well, Cleveland lost that game to the Green Bay Packers, the championship game, 23-12. Let's talk about some of the good stuff, and that being how some of the players felt about Blanton Collier. And let's start off with the biggest one of them all, Jim Brown. He must have been thrilled, as you alluded to earlier, that Collier took the reins off the offense and sort of, for lack of a better term, let it run wild. How did Jim Brown feel about Blanton Collier? What did he have to say about Collier?
Yeah, it's been a lot of years since I talked to him, but the little that we did talk about Blanton, just what you said. I mean, there was a contingent of players, including Jim Brown, in the 3 or 4 years leading up to Collier taking over that, they were, I don't want to say they formed a committee, but there was a lot of complaining by several of the players to the front office, whoever the GM was, or maybe even the Art Modell too, to get rid of Paul Brown. I mean, I've heard that from several players over the years, and they just when Collier opened up the offense and look what they did, it just. I think they felt like they were getting out of prison or something. They were free to showcase their talents, like apparently Brown wasn't allowing them to do. What about, go ahead. What about Frank Ryan? How did he feel about, I'm going to ask you about a couple of players. We started with Brown, and we're going to talk about Ryan and Gary Collins and the great Paul Warfield as well. So how did Frank Ryan feel about they all felt the same way. They all felt the same way, about it. They were all getting bigger numbers, and, I don't think there was one player. There might have been one player that I talked to that was a bigger Paul Brown fan than Blanton Collier fan, but 99% of the players I spoke to were happy, were agreed with the move. And whether you're talking about Frank Ryan or Jim Brown or Gary Collins, they all basically told me the same thing. Ryan was happier because they were throwing the ball more. Brown was happier because he was getting more yards. Collins, Warfield, they felt they felt like they had shackles on in the last few years before Collier took over.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I mean, there really wasn't. They all pretty much told me the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
They all pretty much told me the same thing. Yeah.
So the Browns win the title in '64. They go back in '65, and in your book, you wrote that Gary Collins thought that the 1966 team that went 9-5 was the best team he played on. Why would he say that, especially when you consider the fact that the Browns no longer had Jim Brown to lead the way? So first talk about why Gary Collins would think that the 1966 team was the best.
Well, you know, that's not the first time I've ever heard anything like that. It sounds strange to say. I remember him telling me that. He might be a little biased in terms of that was Frank Ryan's biggest year, passing almost 3,000 yards, 29 touchdowns, and Collins loved to catch passes. So, you know, the passing game obviously was up a notch. But you know, that's not the first time I've heard that. I've heard many Pittsburgh Steelers say that you know, they won 4 Super Bowls in the 70s, and 74, 75, 78, and 79. But I've heard several Steelers in interviews and books say that the 76 team was the best of the 70s, and they didn't even get to the Super Bowl. So, you know, like I said, I'm sure the passing game being what it was that year in '66 probably helped Gary Collins' opinion when he said that. But like I said, I've heard that with different teams besides the Steelers before. I just can't think of another team at this moment. But you know, I mean, they had incredible offensive statistics for the time in 1966.
What about Jim Brown? This is the year that he walked away from the team, and it's just amazing to think that, I guess these were some of the problems with Art Modell. He didn't like the fact that Jim Brown wasn't in camp, that Jim Brown was out filming the movie The Dirty Dozen. It got delayed, so he said he'd be there later. He was only 29 years old, but he was being fined $500 a day, so he said, forget it. I'm not playing for you. How how bizarre is that? I mean, what kind of effect, how did the Browns feel about that?
I do remember him telling me that, you know, nobody tells me what to do, and he said I had absolutely no problem retiring from the game at 29 under those circumstances. It was not a hard decision for him. It was an easy decision. I know, which seems crazy because he probably could have played up at that level through 1970. And I had some players tell me that had Jim Brown stayed around, the Browns might have gotten those Super Bowls in 68 and 69.
Mm-hmm.
But he had no problem with it. As for Brown's management, how they felt about it, I don't know, but I'm sure they were not too thrilled about it because no one knew at the time that Leroy Kelly was going to become a Hall of Famer.
Sure.
And I wouldn't say that Leroy Kelly, he wasn't a better runner than Jim Brown, but that's not. He was still a great runner. And what a lot of people might not remember is that Kelly did not officially replace Jim Brown. Ernie Green replaced Jim Brown at, I think, fullback, and Leroy Kelly became the halfback. I'm pretty sure that's how it went. Green replaced Brown, and then Kelly became the halfback, I think. But Kelly, those first 66, the late 60s, I think he led the NFL in rushing twice. I'm not sure, but him and Gale Sayers were always going back and forth, I think. So that, that's.
Yeah, Leroy Kelly.
That's how that went.
I mean, obviously, it's hard to replace a Jim Brown, but they did have Ernie Green and they had Leroy Kelly. So in 66, Kelly was a halfback, and he rushed for 1,141 yards and scored 15 touchdowns. And that's to go along with 32 receptions for 366 yards and another touchdown. Then in 67, like you said, he led the NFL in rushing and in total yards. So in 67, he had 1,205 yards, scored 11 touchdowns. He averaged 86 yards a game. He averaged 5 yards rushing every time he touched the ball. And again, 282 yards receiving, 2 touchdowns. And then he did even better in 68. Leroy Kelly rushed for 1,239 yards to lead the league. He scored 16 touchdowns. He added another 4 touchdowns receiving, and he led the league in total yards with 1,536. So how good was Leroy? Yeah, tell me about Leroy Kelly.
You know, at that time, I think in 64 and 65, his first 2 years, for the most part, I think he was just a kick returner on special teams, and I think he got in at running back a little bit, but I don't think Modell or anybody really had any idea what kind of running back Leroy Kelly was going to make and that's why they wanted Brown to come back so badly, because he was great, but they also, even though they had Ernie Green, they didn't feel, you know, they didn't feel like nobody knew how great Leroy Kelly was going to be.
Right, he didn't come from a big school. He played for Morgan State.
Sometimes it's timing. I mean, he was in the right place at the right time. Jim Brown retires, and Leroy Kelly gets his chance. I mean, he was, he wasn't just a great running back in 66, 67, and 68. He was also a great running back in 69, 70, 71, 72, 73. Now, obviously, his yardage totals went down when you got into the early 70s a little bit. But, I mean, you know, I think he caught on with the Raiders in the 74 training camp. But I think he played in the WFL. But, I mean, his NFL career, you know, was basically 64 to 73 with the Browns.
Mm-hmm. And he wound up in the Hall of Fame.
And he wound up in the Hall of Fame. And I got a lot of quotes from players about their teammates, and his teammates, I mean, just rave reviews about Leroy Kelly.
So that 1966 season, the Browns went 9-5, and they missed the playoffs for only the second time during Collier's time as head coach. They would only... Yeah, go ahead.
The killer that year in 66 was a Thanksgiving Day loss to Dallas, 26 to 14. I think that was the killer, because I think if they'd have won that game, they might have gone ahead of Dallas in the standings or something. It was very close, but it was that Thanksgiving loss in 66 that really did them in. But I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to get to, no, please, anytime you got something, just let me know. They did make it back to the playoffs in 67, and they again had gone 9-5, but they made the playoffs and again lost to the Dallas Cowboys. But this time in the playoffs, in the divisional round, they got walloped 52-14. But they made it back to the championship game in 1968, and once again they faced the Colts. Now let's refresh our memories. In 1964, as we discussed earlier, the Browns beat the Colts in the championship game 27-0. In 68, the Browns beat the Colts during the regular season 30-20.
That was Baltimore's only loss of the year. That was their only loss of the year.
Right. And this time when they faced them in the championship game, it wasn't pretty. Cleveland lost 34-0. What happened?
Well, before we get to that, the home playoff game against Dallas that year in 68, you know, the game was in Cleveland, but Dallas was favored. And the Browns beat them pretty handily, 31-20. And then the next year they played in the same round at Dallas in the Cotton Bowl, and the Dallas was favored in that game, and the Browns cleaned their clock. So, I mean, the Browns were a playoff nemesis for Dallas in 68 and 69. As for the Baltimore game in 68, I seem to remember a few of the players thinking that because they beat them in the regular season, they were thinking ahead to the Super Bowl.
Someplace that unfortunately the Browns have never made. So they lost that 68 game to the Colts. How good were the Colts?
Oh God, I don't know how many Hall of Famers there were on that team, but they not only were I'm pretty sure they scored the most points in the NFL that year. I think it was over 400 points. I think, and probably more. They probably had more Hall of Famers on offense than they did defense. But I mean, they went 13-1 in the regular season, and let's see, we're talking about 68. So I don't know who they would have beaten the Western Conference Championship. Maybe the Rams or Green Bay. I'm not sure. But it sounds weird saying Baltimore was in the Western Conference with Eastern City, but they were in the Western Conference. But I think the Browns, because they beat them in that regular season game, I think they were looking ahead, and that sounds crazy to be looking ahead from a team that was that good.
Mm-hmm.
The Browns were just never in that game. They were just never in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and then it happened. It happened again in 71. Baltimore played at Cleveland in the divisional playoffs, and Baltimore, a couple drop passes by Cleveland, I think, got them off to a bad start. Baltimore dominated that game too in 71.
Well, yeah, the playoffs in the 68 season, Baltimore beat Minnesota 24-14. Like you said, Cleveland beat Dallas 31-20, and then in the championship game, Baltimore beat Cleveland 34-0. Just so everybody also knows, there was what they call the playoff bowl, where the two losers in the first round actually went up against each other, and in that game, which was played after the championship game, Dallas beat Minnesota 17-13.
You're talking about the playoff bowl in Miami?
Yeah.
Yeah, the playoff bowl in Miami. Yeah, that the little I know about the playoff bowl is that the Browns played in it 3 times, I think, and I have it in the book. I forget what season. Maybe it was 67 when they lost to Dallas. I think they played the Rams. And it was just, there was like 37,000 people in an 80,000 seat stadium there, and it just was not exciting. Not exciting at all.
Right, sure. I don't know why you would play a consolation game.
They played it after the championship?
That is correct. A week later.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. You would think that you would play maybe that on Saturday and the championship game on Sunday, but they didn't do that.
Well, the Final Four in the college basketball, as recently as 79, they had the losers in each semifinal play each other for third place.
Yep, they sure did. They had the consolation game.
Yeah, but I'm willing to bet the consolation game in that was before the championship game. I'm willing to bet, right?
Yes, it was. It was. I think I can't remember if it was played the same day, just earlier, or it had to be the same day. It was the first game, not the second game. Not the day before.
I think 78, 79 was the last season they did that. And then I didn't get interested in college basketball till 79, 80. So I totally have no memory of the third place game.
Right. And just so you know, in 67, Dallas beat Cleveland 52-14.
Yeah.
Green Bay beat Los Angeles, the Rams, 28-7. And then in the championship game, Green Bay on December 31st, 1967, beat the Cowboys 21-17, and then a week later, they had the playoff bowl, January 7th, in the Orange Bowl, and the Rams beat the Browns 30-6. So let's get back to the Browns here and 1969. And when you look back at everything, I think the 1969 season really signaled the end of the Browns, let's call it championship pedigree. I mean, that Cleveland made it to the playoffs and they beat Dallas in the first round, but it lost to Minnesota in the second round 27-7. So let's talk about a few things here. First, Bill Nelson replaced Frank Ryan as the team's quarterback. Why?
before I forget, I just want to mention two things before I forget.
Mm-hmm.
That the 27-7 loss, the Browns had lost in Minnesota earlier in the year 51-3. So that 27-7 loss was much improved over the 51-3 game.
Sure.
And then the second thing I want to say is that the 69 Browns, the only Browns team ever to have at least 80,000 fans at every single home game. The only time it's ever happened in Browns history. Okay, so Bill Nelson replacing Frank Ryan, right? Is that what you said?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, that happened, as I'm sure you know, that happened, I think, in week 3 of 68, the year before. They traded for Nelson in the 68 off-season, and then I'm pretty sure Ryan was the starter in 68 for like the first 2 or 3 games, and the offense, they got beaten badly, I think, by Dallas and Detroit, and their offense was just doing nothing. So Collier, he just, he felt, I got to do something to spark the offense. And I think Nelson came in as the starter for a game against St. Louis. And I'm not sure if they won or not, but even if they lost, you could just tell that the offense was much better with Bill Nelson. And then in that 68 season with Nelson, they went through about an eight game stretch where they scored at least 30 points in like 7 or 8 straight games, and they scored at least 40 points in 3 straight games. And that's 30 points in 7 or 8 straight games. That's the only time that's ever happened in team history.
Mm-hmm.
So, Frank Ryan wasn't thrilled that he was getting replaced, but he understood it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Nelson went 9-2 as a starter in 68, and then as a starter, obviously, during the 69 season, he started all 14 games. Right. He went 10-3-1.
Yeah, Ryan was gone after 68, I think.
Right.
I think Jerry Rome was Nelson's backup in 69, I think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So the defense, 10-3-1, you have Bill Nelson leading the way at quarterback. Leroy Kelly's in the backfield. We really haven't spoken much about Cleveland's defense during our conversation. Talk a little bit about the defense. What kind of defense was it? What was the strengths of the team? Who are the stars of the team?
I don't think it was necessarily a great defense. But I mean, they had, in 69, who did they have? I think they had John Garlington as a linebacker, Jack Gregory as a defensive end, one of the defensive ends. In the defensive backfield, I'm trying to think who was in the defensive backfield. I can't think of any defensive backs, but it wasn't. They weren't. It was the 69 defense. I don't think was a great defense, but I think it was good enough to get them where they got.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think it was good enough to get them where they got. Getting to the NFL championship game 2 straight years, even though they lost, that's no small potatoes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I think that this really, the 69 season, for a myriad of reasons, really signaled the end. And I guess, what about Collier? How did both losses to the Vikings affect him? Is this the point where he decided it was time to start thinking about leaving the game, or did that not enter his mind at that point?
I know it's going to sound crazy. This might be like Gary Collins talking about 1966, but from what I remember from reading Blanton Collier's quotes, which I used in the book from the Plain Dealer, I think the loss to Dallas in the 52-14 loss in 67,
Mm-hmm.
I think he was more upset about that loss than any other loss,
Mm-hmm.
even the championship games. And I do remember writing that at the end of that chapter on 1969, that Blanton Collier was in relatively fine spirits the day after.
Interesting.
Looking ahead to 1970, he was in relatively fine spirits. I remember writing that.
But it was 1970, the draft, that I think is where it all fell apart. So the offseason, and like I said, this is really where Cleveland became a different team. As I say, hindsight is always 20/20. There's a lot to discuss here, and a lot of it had to affect Collier. First, they trade Paul Warfield. So how important or how good was Paul Warfield with the Browns? I think most people would remember Warfield as a Miami Dolphin.
Yeah, I mean, he was just such a great receiver. I think the first sentence of his chapter, I wrote that his last final NFL game was December 18th, 1977, and he should have been inducted into the NFL on December 19th, 1977. He was that good.
Mm-hmm.
He when you watched him run, it didn't look like he was trying that hard because it looks like he was just sort of gliding.
Mm-hmm.
His yards per catch, I mean, with the Browns, I'm not sure about with the Dolphins, but with the Browns, I think he averaged like 20 or 21 yards per catch, which is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think a lot of people liked that trade. I remember a lot of the players telling me they couldn't believe that Paul Warfield was traded. But, Bill Nelson did not have good knees.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess management felt, Mike Phipps was a very talented quarterback from Purdue, and big, strong guy, big Ben Roethlisberger, maybe not as big as Roethlisberger, but still a big body and a big, strong guy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so they made headlines in the Plain Dealer, a la when Bernie Kosar got released in '93.
Right. Let's go back to Warfield for a second, just so you know. In 8 years, that includes his first and second stint with the Browns. He came back to the Browns in '76 after his 1 year in the ill-fated World Football League.
Right.
He averaged for his career with the Browns 19.2 yards per reception.
There you go.
With the Dolphins in 5 years, 21.5 yards per reception.
So there you go. He averaged about 20 yards for his whole NFL career.
Yeah, just absolutely amazing. And now let's get on to Nelson. Why did Cleveland feel compelled to make such a trade? They traded Warfield to the Dolphins for the third pick in the NFL draft, and that wound up being Mike Phipps. Let's hold off on Phipps for a second. What was it about Nelson? Were his knees that bad? Did management just not have the confidence that he was going to be able to lead the team anymore?
That had to have been it. I know his knees were the main factor. They felt he didn't have much time left. They just, from what I was told and from what I remember being told, they just felt that Nelson's knees were probably like Joe Namath's knees, and to get a quarterback the caliber of Mike Phipps, how well he did in college, I guess they felt that, to get something good, you got to give up something good.
Well, let's talk about that, because everyone in the organization, at least this is what you wrote, was really high on Mike Phipps with one exception. And that one exception was the team's head coach, Blanton Collier.
God. Oh my God! I'm so embarrassed that I forgot that I wrote that.
Yeah, that's okay. What did everyone see in him, and what was it that Collier didn't like about him, or was it flat out that Collier just didn't want to trade Warfield?
Now that you bring it up, I'm not sure if I wrote this or not, but I seem to think that Collier may have paid Phipps a visit at Purdue. And I'm not sure. I don't think it was for a game, because it couldn't have been, because he would have been busy with the Browns season. But maybe in the after the season or something. There was something about Phipps. I don't know if it was their interview, but now that you mentioned that, I do remember that Collier, I guess, was the only one that was not high on him. Mm-hmm. I don't remember exactly what it was about Phipps that Collier didn't like. I don't remember that.
Well, I could tell you this. In my research for today's show, I went through the 1970 draft. And I got to tell you, it was not a draft that was rich in quarterbacks. The number one pick that year was a pretty good quarterback, a guy by the name of Terry Bradshaw.
Yeah.
They took Phipps with the number 3 pick. They passed up Mike McCoy, who was a defensive tackle from Notre Dame. And
then the second round.
He was the second pick. McCoy? Yeah, so it went Bradshaw, McCoy, Phipps. And after that, there wasn't another quarterback taken until the 4th pick in the second round, and that was a guy by the name of Dennis Shaw, whom the Buffalo Bills took. And then with the 51st pick in the second round, the Minnesota Vikings took a guy by the name of Bill Kappelman. I mean, this was not a quarterback-rich draft by any stretch of the imagination.
Then who knows? That might have been a contributing factor. The Browns feeling we need a young quarterback. It's not a quarterback-rich draft. We're not going to get Bradshaw. Let's go for Phipps. But I don't think that was the only reason, fearing they wouldn't get another quarterback because it wasn't. I think they really were high on Phipps. I think they really thought he was going to be their quarterback of the future.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, just so you know, if they could have waited one more year, that's when you had Jim Plunkett, who won a couple of Super Bowls, Archie Manning.
That might have been the Archie Manning year, 71.
Yep, 71. Okay. Dan Pastorini. So you had a couple of decent quarterbacks going in the 1971 draft. So talking about sports forgotten heroes. Well, you should maybe do one on Archie Manning. I mean, a lot of people say that had he not spent most of his career with pathetic Saints teams, that he would have been Terry Bradshaw, and Terry Bradshaw would have been Archie Manning. Bradshaw would have gone to New Orleans. Sure. Anything's possible, right?
Yeah.
I just wanted to finish up that thought, just so you know. Lynn Dickey was in that draft. Kenny,
71?
Yep, he went to the Houston Oilers. Kenny Anderson was in that draft, and he went to the Cincinnati Bengals. Yeah. So
that was a good quarterback draft.
Yeah, Joe Theismann was in that draft.
Wow, geez.
Yeah, so if they had been able to hold on for one more year, who knows what would have happened, right? But like I said, hindsight is always 20/20, as the saying goes, and I have no idea what that really means. So for his career, Mike Phipps played 12 years, 7 for the Browns and 5 for the Bears. He started just 71 games, and he compiled a record of 38, 31, and 2. He had a completion percentage of 49.2%.
He had a really good year with the Bears in 79 that made that really good. He had a really good year for the Bears in 79. He was like 9-1 that year as a starter.
Well, his overall record, certainly, 49.2% completion percentage. His quarterback rating was not very impressive. It was 52.6. I think Collier might have been justified in his concern over picking Mike Phipps.
Definitely. I mean, with the Browns, I think Phipps had 40 touchdown passes and 81 interceptions. But I don't know if you read the whole book, but there's a guy named Mike Patika that I interviewed for the book, and he was in the minority, thinking Phipps was not nearly as bad as he showed. He gave his reasons, basically saying, the Browns' offensive line was going downhill. Dick Shafrath was gone, I think, after 71. Gene Nickerson retired after 73. It was just a makeshift line. In Phipps's really bad years of like 74 and 75, I mean, he just gave the argument that Mike Phipps was not nearly as bad as most people say he was. Mm-hmm. But he was in the minority. Well,
it's pretty tough to argue that he wasn't as bad as his record shows. I mean, 55 touchdown passes for his career, 108 interceptions. So for every touchdown pass he threw, he basically threw 2 interceptions. Not too good. And you're right, 1979, he had a really strong year. He started 10 games. He went 9-1. He threw 9 touchdown passes and 8 interceptions.
79 with the Bears. He led them to the playoffs. 72 with the Browns. 72 and 79 were his best years.
Yeah, in 72 he was 10-3. He threw for 13 touchdowns and 16 interceptions.
Yeah. They had a lot of cardiac victories that year. The 72 Browns had a lot of last-minute wins that year. Mm-hmm. So it was actually a pretty exciting year that year. But that was definitely his glory year with the Browns was 72. And he was off to a great start in 76. Against the Jets in the opener, he had 3 touchdown passes, no interceptions. He led them to a 21-10 lead, and then he got injured and missed most of the rest of the year.
Right, he only appeared in 4 games, and that was certainly after Blanton had retired from the game.
Right.
How did the pick of Mike Phipps ultimately affect the career of Blanton Collier? I hate to put it all on the shoulders of Mike Phipps, but I don't think it did. I think Collier, from what I heard, he retired because of his hearing. Now, had Collier not had a hearing problem, would the pick of Phipps, would it be a different story? Maybe. But I can tell you this, in the long run, it paid off for the Browns because the draft pick that they got turned out to be Ozzie Newsome. Oh, that's not a bad pick by any stretch of the imagination. It just took a while to get there.
I think, maybe you're right, that would be too far behind 1970. I think in the 77 trade where he went to the Bears, one of the draft picks the Browns got was Ozzie Newsome. In fact, I know it was, but I think it was from that trade.
So, what to make of Mike Phipps? Of course, you can't pinpoint the demise of the Browns on Phipps. Football is the ultimate team sport, even though the quarterback plays such a pivotal role. And despite the fact that Collier was against drafting Phipps, by the time he was inserted as the starting quarterback, Collier had already retired from the game, and trading Paul Warfield had a more adverse effect, at least I think, on the team than anything or anyone. The fact is, Phipps did have a terrific college career. In fact, he was elected to the College Football Hall of Fame in 2006. At Purdue, Phipps was the starting quarterback for the Boilermakers in 1967, 68, and 69. Each year Purdue was 8-2, and in 1968, the Boilermakers actually started the year as the number 1 ranked team in the country, but finished the year ranked 10th, as Phipps, he missed 2 games due to an ankle injury. For his career at Purdue, Phipps completed 51.2% of his passes, throwing for 5,423 yards, 37 touchdowns, and 34 interceptions. His most notable year was 1969 when he led Purdue to a last-second win over Stanford, a game in which he threw 5 touchdown passes. He also led Purdue past Notre Dame for a 3rd straight year, and he finished 2nd in the Heisman Trophy race behind Steve Owen. Phipps was also a pretty smart guy as he was offered a Rhodes Scholarship, but he turned it down to play in the NFL. In the NFL, however, Phipps, he didn't meet with as much success as Roger and I discussed. He went 10-3 in his first year as a starter, 1972, and he went 7-5-2 in his second year, 1973, which, pretty good start. From there, however, it was really all downhill with Cleveland. After the 1976 season, he was traded to Chicago for a 1977 first-round pick. That pick turned out to be the great Ozzie Newsome. Phipps battled with Bob Avellini and Vince Evans for playing time and finally worked his way into the starting lineup with the Bears in 1979 when he went 9-1. That, folks, was his last really good season, and he left the game after the 1981 season. So let's get back to Blanton real quick. Overall, when we look back at the career of Blanton Collier, how should he be remembered?
I think he should be remembered as a guy who took over for a legend and immediately did better with the same players that the legend was not doing that great with. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he won an NFL title in his second year. And he coached in 3 more NFL title games. Twice came within 1 victory of the Super Bowl. And his worst other than 7-7, his worst record was 9-5.
Not too shabby. And let me ask you this. Why do you think he's, sort of lost in the conversation of great Cleveland coaches, despite the fact that his time with the Browns was the last time the Browns were really a year-in, year-out threat to win the NFL championship?
Well, the late 80s, they were too, the late 80s. But I think that Collier doesn't get the credit he deserves for the same reason the 65 to 69 Browns don't get the credit they deserve. Now, if you're going to ask me what that reason is, why they don't get the credit, that I don't know. But I think, I think it goes hand in hand. The 1965 to 69 Browns are definitely left with the short end when the short end of the stick when the topic is great, memorable years from Browns history. The 40s and 50s, the 64 championship, the Cardiac Kids, and the Bernie Kosar years. Those are those eras that seem to get all the attention. Why that is, I don't know. Especially, they had great attendance in the late 60s. If you read my preface, they were regularly getting crowds 77, 78, 81, 82,000. So it's not like fans were not showing up at the stadium, but for some reason, and then you could say, well, okay, it's so long ago that maybe people just don't remember it. Well, if that's the case, then why are the 40 and 50s brought up, So, and I think the fact that Blanton Collier was the head coach of that team, he was the head coach of those teams that don't get respect. So, of course, he's not going to get the respect he should, because he was the head coach of teams that don't get that respect. Mm-hmm. Why that is, why they don't get that respect, that I don't know. I just hope that the book will show readers, older readers and people who are not alive back then, how important the 65 to 69 Browns were to the history of the franchise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Roger, thank you for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. It's always great speaking with you. And when you publish your next book, I certainly hope you'll consider coming back on.
Great. I appreciate that.
Over the years, there have been so many coaches in every sport who have been overshadowed or forgotten for a myriad of reasons. Guys who have won championships, but they did so in the shadows of their predecessors. In football, one of whom comes to mind immediately is George Seifert, who won with the 49ers after Bill Walsh had stepped down. In baseball, the Oakland A's won 3 World Series in a row, 1972, 73, and 74, and most think Dick Williams managed the team each year, but that's not true. Alvin Dark was at the helm in 1974. It happens. And when it comes to the Browns, most think that all of their legendary teams were coached by Paul Brown, and that after he left, no one else won. Well, Blanton Collier came aboard and led the Browns to the 1964 NFL Championship. One last note about Blanton. The University of Kentucky honored him by naming an award after him which recognizes individuals who excel on the football field and give back off of it. Guys like Tony Dungy, Jim Brown, Gale Sayers, and the entire Manning family have all won this prestigious award. Now, for today's mailbag, Andy Brown, I'm guessing from the St. Louis area, or at least a St. Louis sports fan, sent in a suggestion on sportsfh.com. Andy said, I would love to see a podcast on the spirit of St. Louis. The current general manager of the Orlando Magic is Jeff Weltman. During the time the Spirits were in St. Louis, Jeff was an elementary school student while his dad ran the team. He would be a fascinating guest to talk about a very colorful franchise with an interesting history. Thank you. I love your podcast. Well, Andy, thank you for the suggestion. I will certainly reach out to the Magic and Mr. Weltman to see if we can do something on this old ABA franchise. We're getting into the hoop season, so it certainly is timely. If you have a suggestion or comment, please let us know by visiting sportsfh.com and just fill out the form and hit send. I'd like to once again thank today's guest, Roger Gordon, author of Blanton's Browns, a truly terrific book about one of football's most dominant teams. Also, thanks to all of you for listening, and we'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.